The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. The moon was high, its pale light cutting through the skeletal branches overhead, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. He had been walking for nearly an hour, the quiet of the night wrapping around him like a heavy cloak. There was something about the solitude that soothed him, the way the world seemed to slow when no one else was around. But then, something changed. A presence. At first it was just a feeling, an instinctual prickle at the back of his neck, an awareness that he was no longer alone. His steps faltered. He turned his head slightly, scanning the darkness beyond the trees. Nothing. Yet, his pulse quickened, his body tensed, as if some unseen force was warning him. Then he saw her. A figure stood a few feet away, half hidden between the trees, barely more than a silhouette. But even in the dim light, something about her was unnatural. Her skin, what little of it was visible, gleamed faintly under the moon, like polished silver or something not quite human. She wasn't moving, only staring at him with wide eyes, her expression frozen in something that sent a chill down his spine. Fear. She was afraid of him. His breath caught. He wasn't sure what he had expected. A lost hiker, maybe, or some drifter wandering the woods. But the way she looked at him, her entire body rigid with terror, was different. This wasn't the kind of fear a person felt when encountering a stranger in the dark. This was something deeper, more primal. And then she ran. One moment she was there, the next she was gone, her body twisting into motion with an impossible speed. Branches snapped as she tore through the undergrowth, her form flickering between patches of moonlight, like a ghost vanishing into the trees. His heart slammed against his ribs. "Hey, wait!" he called out, but she was already disappearing. He didn't think. He moved. The logical part of his brain screamed at him to stop, to turn around, to leave this strange woman and her fear behind. But curiosity, or maybe something stronger, drove him forward. His feet pounded against the earth as he sprinted after her, the cold air burning his lungs. She was fast. Faster than any human had a right to be. No matter how hard he pushed himself, she stayed ahead, her figure just out of reach, darting between trees with inhuman agility. But she was panicked, and panic made people reckless. She made a mistake. A root, half buried beneath the leaves, caught her foot. She stumbled. It wasn't much, just a split second, but it was enough. He lunged, closing the gap between them. "Stop!" he shouted, grabbing for her arm. His fingers barely brushed her skin before she twisted away, but her footing was already lost. With a strangled gasp, she fell, her body crashing into the cold earth. He skidded to a stop, breathless, his mind racing. She scrambled backward, her hands digging into the dirt, her chest rising and falling in sharp, frantic gasps. Her eyes, now fully visible in the moonlight, were an impossible shade of violet, wide with desperation. "Please." Her voice was barely more than a whisper, shaking with something he didn't understand. You don't understand." He took a cautious step forward, holding his hands up in what he hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "I'm not going to hurt you." She let out a strangled laugh, short, bitter. "That's not the problem." He frowned. "Then what is?" Her gaze darted past him, scanning the trees as if expecting something, or someone, to emerge from the darkness. She swallowed hard, and for the first time, he noticed the way her hands trembled, not just with fear but with something deeper. Guilt. "You shouldn't have followed me," she said finally, her voice raw. "You weren't supposed to see me." He hesitated. The way she said it, it wasn't just fear of being caught. There was something more, something that felt disturbingly final. "Who are you?" he asked. She shook her head. "That doesn't matter." "It does to me." For a long moment, she just stared at him, her breath uneven, her body coiled tight like an animal backed into a corner. And then, in a voice so soft he barely heard it, she whispered, "I was sent to kill you." The words didn't make sense at first. They just hung there between them, surreal and impossible. Then the weight of them crashed down, sending an icy bolt of shock through his veins. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. She squeezed her eyes shut, as if she couldn't bear to see his reaction. "I didn't want to," she said, her voice breaking, "but it was my mission, my purpose." His heart pounded. "Then why haven't you?" She exhaled shakily, her hands curling into fists. "Because you're not what I expected." His mind raced. He should be afraid. Any sane person would be. But as he looked at her, really looked at her, he didn't see a killer. He saw someone terrified, struggling against something bigger than herself. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice quiet. Her lips parted, but she didn't answer. Because in that moment, the forest around them changed. A sound, low and distant, rippled through the trees. Not the wind, not an animal. Something else. Something unnatural. Her head snapped up, her violet eyes going wide with horror. "They're coming," she whispered. And for the first time, he understood. Whatever fear she felt of him, whatever hesitation had kept her from fulfilling her mission, there were others who wouldn't hesitate, others who would finish what she had started. A chill ran down his spine. The hunt had begun. The sound that rippled through the trees was low, almost imperceptible, but it carried a weight that made the air feel heavy. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. It was something else, something deliberate. She heard it first. Her entire body went rigid, her breath catching in her throat. He saw her hands curl into fists, fingers digging into the dirt, as if she could ground herself against the terror creeping into her expression. "They're coming," she whispered again, but this time her voice barely carried. His instincts screamed at him to run. Whatever this was, whoever was coming, he wanted no part of it. And yet, he stood frozen, his mind grasping at the pieces of a puzzle he didn't understand. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low. She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time. For a split second, something flickered across her face. Hesitation, doubt. A war waged inside her, and he could tell she was struggling with something she had never questioned before. Finally, she exhaled and pushed herself to her feet. "We have to move," she said. He didn't argue. The urgency in her voice left no room for debate. She turned and took off, her movements swift and precise despite the fear evident in her posture. He followed, adrenaline pumping through his veins. They ran deeper into the forest, the branches clawing at them as the sound behind them grew louder. It was closer now, still distant but approaching fast. "What is that?" he demanded between breaths. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she scanned the area as they ran, searching for something. Then, abruptly, she veered to the right, grabbing his wrist and yanking him with her. He nearly stumbled, but caught himself as they darted behind a dense thicket of trees and crouched low. She pressed a finger to her lips, signaling him to stay silent. He obeyed, though his pulse hammered in his ears. A few moments passed before he heard them. Footsteps. Not just one set, several. They were steady, purposeful, moving in unison. Not like hunters tracking prey, but like soldiers sweeping an area, searching for something, or someone. Him. The realization sent a shiver down his spine. His gaze flickered to her. She was tense, her breathing shallow, her eyes locked on the space between the trees where the figures were beginning to emerge. They weren't normal. Their movements were too smooth, too calculated. Even in the darkness, he could see the way they scanned the area with unnatural precision. Their skin, pale, almost luminous, mirrored hers, but unlike her, there was no hesitation in them. They were here to finish what she had refused to do. She shifted slightly, positioning herself between him and them, as if shielding him. It didn't make sense. If she had been sent to kill him, why was she protecting him now? One of the figures paused. His head tilted slightly, and for a moment, it looked as though he had caught their scent. She tensed. Then, in an impossibly smooth motion, she reached out and grabbed something small from the pouch at her waist. Before he could react, she crushed it in her palm. A faint shimmer pulsed through the air, almost like a ripple in water. The figures hesitated. Then, without warning, they turned and moved in the opposite direction, their footsteps fading into the distance. Silence. He exhaled sharply, realizing he had been holding his breath. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she leaned back against the tree and closed her eyes for a brief second. When she opened them again, something in her gaze had shifted. "They would have killed you," she said quietly, without hesitation, without question. He swallowed hard. "Why?" Her lips parted, but she hesitated. And then she did something unexpected. She reached for his hand. The touch was light, almost hesitant, but as soon as her skin met his, something changed. A sensation flooded through him, warmth, energy, like an electric current humming beneath his skin. His breath hitched, and for a moment, the world around them blurred. Images, not memories, but something deeper. Echoes of something vast, something ancient. A sky filled with stars that didn't belong to Earth. A city bathed in silver light. And then, war, destruction. A choice that had been made long before he was born. He gasped, yanking his hand back. The connection broke instantly, and he stumbled backward, his mind reeling. "What the hell was that?" he demanded. She didn't look surprised. If anything, she looked resigned. "That was the truth," she said softly. He shook his head, trying to steady himself. "I don't understand." "You will," she exhaled. "You have to." He ran a hand through his hair, his pulse still erratic. "Start talking." She hesitated again, but then nodded. "Your existence is an anomaly," she said. "You weren't supposed to be born. Not like this. Not on Earth." His blood ran cold. "What?" She took a step closer. "You are the key to something much bigger than you realize, something that could change everything. Your survival threatens the balance that has been in place for centuries." His breath came in short, uneven gasps. "That doesn't make sense. I'm just a normal guy." She gave him a sad, knowing look. "Number you're not." He wanted to deny it, to laugh it off as some insane conspiracy, but after what he had just seen, what he had felt, he couldn't. "Then tell me who I am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated for only a second before she answered. "You are the last descendant of a bloodline that should have ended long ago." The weight of her words settled over him like a crushing force. "I was sent to make sure you never learned the truth," she admitted. "But now I don't know what's right anymore." He stared at her, a storm of emotions raging inside him. Fear, confusion, disbelief. But beneath it all, one question burned the brightest. "What happens now?" She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "That depends," she said. "Do you want to live?" The answer should have been obvious, but in that moment, with everything he thought he knew about his life unraveling around him, he realized something terrifying. He wasn't sure. The forest felt different now. The night was still, yet every shadow seemed to breathe. Every whisper of wind carried a threat he couldn't quite name. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, but it wasn't just fear anymore. It was something else, something deeper. He wasn't supposed to exist. He was an anomaly. And the woman standing before him, who was sent to kill him, had just defied everything she believed by sparing him. The weight of it pressed down on him, but he forced himself to breathe. He had to stay grounded, had to push away the overwhelming urge to run and pretend none of this was real, because it was. "What do you mean, do I want to live?" he asked, his voice quieter than he intended. She held his gaze, her violet eyes searching his, looking for something he wasn't sure he even had. "I mean exactly that," she said. "If you choose to live, everything changes. There's no undoing this. They won't stop hunting you. Not ever. A chill ran down his spine. And if I don't choose? For the first time, she looked away. Then I finish what I was sent to do. His breath caught. The words should have filled him with rage, but they didn't. Instead, he just felt hollow. Because she wasn't saying them like a threat. She was saying them like a fact, like it hurt her to even speak them. He studied her, trying to understand. You don't want to kill me. Her jaw clenched. It doesn't matter what I want. But you didn't do it. Silence stretched between them. Then softly she said, No, I didn't. The unspoken words lingered in the air, and I don't know why. He swallowed hard, his mind spinning. Tell me the truth, he said. All of it. She hesitated. Then she took a slow breath and nodded. Our worlds were never supposed to cross, she began, her voice steady, but heavy with something unspoken. A long time ago, your ancestors, they were part of something greater, a civilization far beyond this world, but they broke a rule, one of the oldest, one that was never meant to be defied. What rule? He asked. She hesitated before saying, They chose to hide here. The words sent a shiver through him. He had expected something bigger, something more dramatic, but the simplicity of it made it worse. They weren't just running from something, she continued. They were running from us. His stomach tightened. Why? She exhaled, running a hand through her hair. Because they carried something dangerous, a power that, if left unchecked, could tip the balance of everything. He frowned. What kind of power? She looked at him for a long moment, then said, It's in you. His breath caught. She took a cautious step forward. You don't feel it yet, do you? She asked. He shook his head. I don't even know what you're talking about. You will. A cold knot settled in his stomach. This doesn't make sense, he muttered, shaking his head. I've lived a completely normal life. No secret powers, no signs that I'm anything other than just... You're not normal, she interrupted. You've just never been activated. The word sent another shiver through him. Activated? She nodded. Your ancestors locked it away, buried it so deep you wouldn't even know it was there, but it's still inside you waiting. For what? He asked. She hesitated. For the right moment. A cold dread curled around his spine. And what happens when that moment comes? Her eyes darkened. That's what they're afraid of. The weight of her words settled over him like a storm cloud. He wanted to deny it, to push back against the insanity of it all, but the way she looked at him, the way she spoke, it was too real to ignore. He took a shaky breath. So, if I choose to live, I'll have to run for the rest of my life? She hesitated before nodding. Yes. And if I don't, I'll make sure it's painless. The way she said it, softly, almost like a promise, made something inside him break. She was giving him a choice, but it wasn't really a choice at all, because despite everything, despite the fear and the overwhelming confusion, there was only one answer. I want to live. She exhaled, something like relief flickering in her expression before she quickly masked it. Then we need to go. Now. He barely had time to react before she grabbed his hand and pulled him forward. They ran, deeper into the forest, away from the path, away from everything he had ever known. And for the first time in his life, he had no idea what came next. The night stretched endlessly as they ran, the cold air biting at his skin, but adrenaline kept him moving. The forest blurred around him, trees twisting into dark figures, the ground uneven beneath his feet. She was ahead of him, moving like she was born for this, her body fluid, her steps silent. He had no idea where they were going, but he trusted her. He had to. Behind them, the silence felt unnatural. Wrong. They're still close, aren't they? He panted. She didn't look back. Yes, The way she said it sent a chill through him. It wasn't fear, but certainty. She knew how relentless they were, knew they would never stop. A branch snapped somewhere in the distance. Too close. His breath hitched. How are they tracking us? She hesitated before answering. You. His stomach twisted. Me? They don't need to see us, she explained. They can feel you just like I can. His legs nearly faltered, but he forced himself to keep up. What does that mean? She exhaled sharply. It means you're waking up. That should have terrified him. Maybe it did. But there was no time to process it. She suddenly veered left, pulling him with her. They skidded down a small slope, their feet barely finding purchase before they hit the ground running again. The terrain was shifting, rockier, uneven. He barely had time to adjust before she yanked him behind a fallen tree and shoved him down. Stay low, she whispered. His heart pounded as he crouched beside her, his breath coming fast and shallow. The night had changed. He could feel it. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was pressure. The air was heavy, the energy shifting, coiling around them like something alive. It crawled under his skin, hummed in his bones. He clenched his fists, trying to suppress the unfamiliar sensation. Then he saw them. Figures moving through the trees, too smooth, too precise. Their pale skin shimmered faintly under the moonlight, almost blending into the darkness. They moved without hesitation, without uncertainty. They knew he was here. A hand brushed his wrist. He flinched, but it was just her. Her grip was firm, grounding him. When he turned his head, her violet eyes locked onto his, something fierce burning behind them. You have to stay calm, she murmured. If you panic, they'll find us faster. He swallowed hard, nodding, though it took everything in him to keep his breathing steady. One of the figures stopped. His heart stuttered. They were only a few feet away now, too close. A soft, whispering sound filled the air, like wind through dead leaves. It wasn't a language he understood, but it made his skin crawl. Then silence. The figure tilted its head. For a second he swore it was looking right at them. His muscles locked, his instincts screaming at him to run. And then suddenly, she moved. Before he could react, she pressed her hand over his chest. A shock ran through him, not painful but deep, like something inside him had just been pushed down, buried. His breath hitched. The feeling under his skin, the pressure vanished. The figure hesitated. Then it turned. It walked away. He stayed frozen, his pulse hammering in his ears. She didn't move until the last of them had disappeared into the darkness. Only then did she exhale, her shoulders sagging slightly. What the hell was that? He whispered. She pulled her hand away, her expression unreadable. I masked you. He blinked. You, what? You were radiating energy, she explained. They could sense it. I suppressed it. His skin prickled. How? A pause. Then, because I'm like them. The words hit him harder than he expected. He had known, of course. She wasn't human. He had seen the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she had looked at him that first night, like he was something dangerous. But hearing her admit it made it feel more real. She stood, offering him a hand. He hesitated only for a second before taking it. Her fingers were warm, solid. Once he was on his feet, she pulled back quickly. We have to keep moving, she said. He didn't argue. They slipped through the forest, quieter now, more careful. The silence between them stretched, but his mind was spinning. She had saved him. Again. And yet, she had been sent to kill him. Finally, he broke the silence. Why are you helping me? She didn't answer right away. Then, softly, almost like she hated saying it, because I don't know who the real enemy is anymore. That stopped him in his tracks. She turned to face him, her expression hard but uncertain. Everything I was taught, everything I believed, was built around stopping you. But they never told me why. Not really. Just that you couldn't live. His stomach tightened. And now? Her jaw clenched. Now I'm starting to think they were afraid of you." The way she said it sent a shiver down his spine, because she wasn't talking about fear in a way that made sense. She wasn't saying they feared him because he was a threat. She was saying they feared him because of what he could become. And that terrified him more than anything else. The night air was thick, pressing down on him like an invisible weight. Every breath felt heavy, every step uncertain. The forest stretched endlessly, its darkness wrapping around them like something alive. He could still feel the lingering pressure from whatever had just happened, the way she had touched his chest and silenced whatever was waking inside him. He wasn't sure if he was grateful or terrified. "They won't stop," he murmured. She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "No." A beat of silence. "You said they were afraid of me," he continued, his voice quieter now. "Why?" She hesitated. "Because of what's inside you." He clenched his fists. "You keep saying that, but I don't feel any different." She slowed, turning to face him. The moonlight caught the edges of her face, making her look almost human. Almost. "You don't feel it yet," she said, "but I do. And they do too." A shiver crawled down his spine. "Then tell me what it is." She exhaled, eyes searching his. Then finally, "You're the last." The words sent a chill through him. "The last what?" he asked. She took a step closer, lowering her voice as though the trees themselves were listening. "The last of your kind. The last remnant of something that was erased a long time ago." He shook his head. "That doesn't make sense. I grew up here. I have a family." "They aren't yours," she cut in, her voice gentler than he expected. "Not by blood." The ground beneath him seemed to tilt. He swallowed hard, his mind scrambling for something to hold on to. That's not... They hid you." The certainty in her voice stole his breath. She took another step closer. "The people you think are your parents. They were chosen to protect you, to keep you hidden until the day came when you would wake up." His pulse roared in his ears. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But deep inside, something small and quiet, whispered that it was true. "That's why they sent me," she continued, "to stop it before it happens." A sharp, bitter laugh escaped him. "Before what happens?" She hesitated. "Before you remember." A strange pressure swelled in his chest, something deep, something heavy. He took a shaky step back. "I don't want to remember." Her eyes darkened. "You won't have a choice." The ground beneath them trembled. His breath hitched. "What?" "Stop," she said quickly, stepping forward. "Breathe." His vision blurred at the edges. A strange heat was building under his skin, something deep and ancient clawing its way to the surface. He could feel it now, feel the thing she had been talking about, the thing that had been buried inside him his whole life, and it was waking up. He stumbled back, gasping. "What's happening to me?" She grabbed his wrist, her touch grounding him. "You have to control it. If you let it out too fast, they'll find us again." He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to breathe. The pressure lessened, but it didn't disappear. It was still there, thrumming just beneath his skin, waiting. When he opened his eyes again, she was watching him closely. "You're stronger than I expected," she murmured. A shudder ran through him. "That makes one of us." She released his wrist, stepping back. "We need to move." He hesitated. "Where are we even going?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered in her expression. "Somewhere safe." He let out a hollow laugh. "I don't think that place exists." A pause, then softly, "Not anymore." The words settled in his chest like a stone. He wanted to run, to turn back, to pretend none of this was happening. But there was no going back. Not now. So he followed her into the night, toward whatever future waited for him. The wind had changed. It carried a strange, charged energy, whispering through the trees, as though the forest itself could sense what was coming. Every rustling leaf, every distant echo of movement sent a chill through him. They weren't safe. Not yet. She moved ahead of him, her form barely a shadow in the dim moonlight. Every step she took was precise, deliberate, like she had been running her whole life. Maybe she had. "How much further?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't slow. "Not far." It wasn't much of an answer, but he let it go. He didn't have the energy to push her. His body felt off. Every inch of his skin tingled. Every breath felt heavier than it should. And there was something else, something inside him. It had been there before, lingering just beneath the surface, but now it was louder, awake. He clenched his fists. "You're feeling it, aren't you?" Her voice cut through the night, quiet but certain. He hesitated before answering. "I don't even know what it is." She finally slowed, turning to face him. "It's your memory." His chest tightened. "Number I'd know if—" "You think memories are just thoughts?" she interrupted. "They're more than that. They live in you, in your bones, in your blood." A shiver crawled down his spine. She took a step closer. "That's why they fear you, because you aren't just some lost survivor of a dead people." Her eyes darkened. "You are the last of their gods." The ground beneath him seemed to sway. He let out a shaky laugh, rubbing his face. "God? That's insane." "Not God in the way you think," she corrected. "Not divinity. Not immortality." A pause. "But power. Enough to destroy them." His pulse roared in his ears. "I don't—" He shook his head. "I don't remember any of that." "You will." The certainty in her voice terrified him. He turned away, his hands shaking. "I don't want to." "It doesn't matter what you want," she said. "It's already happening." She reached out and pressed her palm against his chest, just like before. Only this time, she didn't suppress it. The world shifted. A sharp electric sensation tore through him, white-hot and endless. His knees buckled. The air around him rippled like a mirage, and suddenly, he saw. Not just memories, not just flashes of another life. He saw himself, not as he was now, but as he had been, as something more. A battlefield stretched before him, skies torn apart by streaks of fire. His hands, glowing, thrumming with power, were outstretched, unleashing something so vast, so terrible, that the very ground split beneath him. Screams filled the air, not human screams, not even them, but something older, something worse. And then, a face, not hers, someone else, someone with eyes like dying stars, their voice echoing in his skull. "You must fall so they can rise." The vision shattered. He gasped, stumbling back. His hands were still trembling, but there was no glow, no battlefield. Only the forest, only the night. She was watching him. "You saw it." He could barely breathe. "What was that?" Her voice was softer now. "The truth." His heart pounded. I was—" She nodded. "Yes." The weight of it crushed him. He had been the destroyer, the warbringer, and now he was the last. He clenched his fists. "That's why they want me dead." She hesitated. "Yes." The wind howled through the trees, wrapping around them like ghosts. He swallowed hard. "Are you going to do it?" For a long moment she didn't answer. Then, so quietly, he almost didn't hear it. "No." His breath hitched. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and for the first time he saw something different in her eyes. Not just fear, not just uncertainty, but choice. And that, more than anything, told him that whatever was coming, it had already begun. The night felt heavier now, thick with the weight of something inevitable. The forest no longer seemed like a place to hide, but a threshold to something greater, something neither of them fully understood. The wind whispered through the trees, rustling the leaves as if the world itself was bracing for what was to come. He wasn't the same man who had wandered into these woods hours ago. The memories, his memories, were returning in pieces, like shattered glass trying to form a whole again. He had seen glimpses of war, of destruction, of a power too vast to comprehend. But the thing that unsettled him most wasn't the carnage. It was the look in his past self's eyes. It wasn't rage. It wasn't cruelty. It was purpose, a terrible, absolute purpose. And now here he was, the last remnant of that forgotten war, standing between what was and what could be. She watched him in silence, her gaze unreadable. For so long she had been his pursuer, his executioner, the one meant to end this before it began. But something had changed. She had changed. "You understand now, don't you?" she said softly. He exhaled. "I don't know if I understand anything anymore. You were never meant to survive. I figured that out." She hesitated. "But you did. And because of that, they are afraid." He ran a hand through his hair. "So what happens now? If I'm as dangerous as they think I am, what do I do?" For the first time, she looked unsure. "The choice was never mine to make," she admitted. "It was always yours." He frowned. "I don't—" A sudden tremor cut through the air. The trees groaned, the ground beneath them vibrating like something massive was approaching. He felt it before he heard it, an unnatural hum that sent an icy pulse through his spine. "They're here," she whispered. The night split open with light. Blinding beams cut through the forest, illuminating the twisting branches like bones against the sky. The hum grew louder, vibrating in his chest, in his skull. A pressure built around them, something vast and watching. Shapes emerged from the light, tall, angular figures, their forms bending at unnatural angles. They moved without sound, without effort, gliding forward as though the world itself bent to their will. He knew them, not by name, not by face, but by instinct, the ones who had ended his kind, the ones who had buried the past and rewritten history in their image. One of them stepped forward, taller than the rest. Its voice was not spoken, but felt, a vibration in the mind, a whisper through the bones. "It is over." His body tensed, that familiar heat rising again. "You are the last echo of a dead war. Your existence is a threat to all that remains." Beside him, she stiffened. "You don't have to listen to them," she murmured. The taller figure tilted its head slightly. "And yet she, too, was sent to end you." A pause. Then, "But she failed." Something cold gripped his heart. He glanced at her, searching for hesitation, for regret. Instead, he saw only defiance. "You were right," she said, her voice steady. "I was sent to kill you." A breath. "But now I choose not to." A ripple of something, not quite anger, not quite surprise, passed through the figures before them. The taller one took a step forward, lowering its head slightly. "You are mistaken to believe you have a choice." The hum grew sharper, the pressure increasing. He felt it wrap around him, pressing into his skin, into his skull, erasing. They weren't trying to kill him. They were trying to unmake him. His knees buckled, his vision blurred. Somewhere far away, he heard her shouting his name. Then, a spark, deep inside, in the place where the memories had been buried. A flicker of something old, something vast, something angry. He didn't fight it this time. He let it in. The world exploded. Light erupted from his skin, a force so powerful it cracked the air itself. The figures recoiled, their hum turning into something else, something almost like fear. He rose to his feet, his breath steady, his pulse thrumming with ancient power. He could feel it now, the thing they had tried so hard to bury. It wasn't rage, it wasn't destruction, it was balance, a power not meant to conquer, but to restore. The tallest figure straightened, its form flickering. "You cannot undo what has already been done." His voice, when he spoke, was calm. "No." He lifted his hand, and the world pulsed around him. "But I can make sure it doesn't happen again." A final, silent beat. Then, light. The figures dissolved, their forms scattering like dust in the wind. The hum faded, the pressure lifted, and then silence. The forest was still. The air was clean. He let out a shaky breath, turning to her. She was watching him, not with fear, but with something else, something like understanding. "It's over," he said. She nodded slowly. "For now." He looked up at the sky, at the vast, endless dark stretching beyond the trees. He didn't know what came next. He didn't know if there were more of them, if they would return, if this was only the beginning of something even greater. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid. For the first time, he wasn't running. He had a past now. He had a truth. And more than anything, he had a choice. He turned back to her. "Are you coming with me?" A pause. Then, a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Where?" she asked. He exhaled, a weight lifting from his chest. "Wherever we want." And together, they stepped into the night, two remnants of a forgotten past, walking toward a future only they could create.